OS 2200 QProcessor System Replication. In this presentation, we'll review the various tasks to perform system replication. The two main reasons to replicate the OS 2200 QProcessor may be for production staging and disaster recovery. Replication is typically done of an entire HA cluster pair. Let's review the network. As you can see, for a single HA cluster pair, there would be two OS 2200 QProcessors that has access to some external storage. There'd be a pair of AM/LAN switches and an OS 2200 partition and some operations servers. When we set up the system replication, the first thing you have to keep in mind is that you'd want to do a parallel network. This means that all network addresses that are used in the primary systems complex are the same that you used in the secondary. This makes sharing data and going between them a lot easier. Disk replication for the customer supplied SAN and external storage should also be done. This is recommended so that when updates are made to the disks for MQ data, that the other secondary site receives the updates as well. EMC PowerPath is a good option and we recommend that as well. The OS 2200 disks may also be shared. If you do this, you can boot both OS 2200 partitions from the same set of storage media. Here's an example of what replicated systems would look like. As you can see, the QProc storage is replicated between both the primary systems and the DR systems in this case. If you take a look at the addressing, the 172.28, 102.11, and 21 are the management IP addresses of both QProcessors on the primary side. And as you can see over on the DR side, these QProcessors are configured with the same addresses. The address to get to the OS 2200 primary system is 128.172.28.101.10, and this is the same address that we use over on the DR side. Likewise, the operation servers are replicated and also share the same address. The OS 2200 SAN, as shown in this picture, can move between the two OS 2200 partitions. Before replicating the OS 2200 QProcessor environment, you have two options. The first option is to configure both sets of systems using the Administration Console's Initial Configuration Wizard. The Initial Configuration Wizard steps you through various inputs that include the network addresses of the AM/LAN, the operation server's network addresses, the OS 2200 partitions, administration user ID and addresses. This would have to be done on both pairs. If you're using HA, the HA cluster would also have to be configured manually. The user IDs, if you use OAM security, they would need to be entered on the two sets of HA clusters. The second option you can use is to minimally configure the backup system and then use the Administration Console Filesystem Backup module to restore the archive taken from the primary systems. This option shortcuts a lot of the steps and ensures that your data is entered identically. Either option, you will be required to install WMQ 2200 on all OS 2200 QProcessors. Let's take a look at option 2, using the Filesystem Backup module included with the Administration Console. This assumes that your primary systems have been configured. This means the initial configuration has been run, your IP addresses have been set, your DNS names, your host names, everything is set up the way you want them. WMQ 2200 has been installed on both cluster nodes. Any user IDs that need to be mapped to QProcessor groups have been done. The MQ storage groups have been created and your queue managers have been created on them. You have also configured your HA cluster pair on your primary systems. After this is done, you'll want to run all your backup profiles and secure them on 2200 disks that are available for each the primary cluster pair and the DR cluster pair. So the backup profiles that are included with your system include the network, the system configuration, the HA cluster, and then the rejoin existing HA cluster. We also assume that the secondary OS 2200 partition has access to the primary's disks. Taking backups of your primary systems is the first step to creating your replicated systems. We use the Filesystem backup module. Here you see all the default backup profiles. We can go in and edit each one. We'll start with the network configuration and make sure that it contains the files that we require, and we recommend that you set the OS 2200 file qualifier to the name of the host so you'll be able to find it later. You can set alternate pack ID if required. You hit Save and Backup, and this creates your archive on the 2200 system. After the network configuration is collected, we'll also want to collect up the system configuration. There are two default profiles if you're recovering an HA cluster. The first is the default HA cluster profile, which you use if you lose both nodes of the cluster or if you're doing replication. And the other one is the rejoin existing HA cluster. You'll want both these profiles on hand from both systems in case you need to restore them. A few points about restoring the network configuration archive. If the network backup archive was taken before the HA cluster is in place, it will not include HB1 addressing information that is required for HA heartbeat operations. It will include, though, any application IP addresses that you have configured and any optional public IP addresses that you have added. If you take your network backup archive after you configure the HA cluster, then you will have captured the HB1 addressing information needed for heartbeat, but just a note, it won't include any network information about network resources that have been added to the HA cluster. This information will now be restored when the HA cluster definitions are restored. So when you restore a network backup from this post-HA cluster, you'll notice that the display will have a blank for the application IP address and blanks for the public IP address. Just a note, don't be alarmed, this information is contained within the HA cluster backup archives. Once backups are taken, you can then replicate the new systems by using the Restore button on the Filesystem Backup main page. Once the Restore button is selected, you can enter the qualifier of the system you wish to replicate, and you will see all the backups that were previously taken. You'll want to restore the default network profile first, then the default system profile. You'll want to make sure both nodes, if you're clustered, are restored before continuing to replicate the cluster settings. To replicate the cluster settings, on the first node you'll want to restore the default HA clustering archive. This will restore the cluster configuration plus any services that are needed. And then on the second node, once the first node is finished, you'll want to restore the rejoin existing HA cluster archive. This should bring your systems back up to the proper levels. This completes this demo.